Identify. Do you have eyes on the trigger man? The voice in her earpiece was jagged, stripped of the earlier arrogance. It was the sound of a man watching his friends bleed out in the dust. Negative on the trigger man. I have a spotter. A child. Maybe 12 years old. He's holding the wire. Take the shot, Vance. If he connects that circuit, the whole courtyard goes up. Take the damn shot. Elara didn't blink. Through the scope, the world was awash of green phosphor and gray heat signatures. She saw the boy's trembling hands. She saw the wire. She also saw the shadow in the doorway behind him. The puppet master. Vance, do you copy? Engage! If I shoot the boy, the handler runs and he detonates the secondary on your flank, she whispered, her voice devoid of tremors. I have to let him connect it. Are you insane? We're standing on the primary charge. Trust the math, Lieutenant. Or don't. I'm taking the handler. Vance, I swear to God if you... She exhaled. The space between heartbeats stretched into an eternity. She shifted her aim past the child, waiting for the spark that would signal the end of everything. 3 seconds to impact. Transmission cuts to static. 48 hours earlier, forward operating base Anvil. Time, 1400 Zulu, location, tarmac, forward operating base Anvil, ROE, status green, weapons cold. The heat on the tarmac was a physical weight, pressing down on the shoulders of the men gathering near the ramp of the C-130 Hercules. It smelled of burnt kerosene and aggressive testosterone. Corporal Elara Vance adjusted the strap of her drag bag, shifting the 30-pound case containing her Mk-13 Mod 7 sniper rifle. She stood 5'4", weighing a $120 soaking wet. Surrounded by the hulking frames of Bravo Platoon, Tier 1 operators with beards thick enough to hide a sidearm and biceps the size of her thighs, she looked less like a soldier and more like a high school student who had wandered onto a movie set. She kept her eyes on the horizon, ignoring the murmurs. I'm telling you, it's a PR stunt, a voice grumbled to her left. It was Sledge, the team's breacher, a mountain of a man holding a saw like it was a toy. Command wants a poster girl. Look, we're inclusive. So they saddle us with a mascot. Check the file, Sledge, another voice drawled. She's 18, maybe 19. Probably hasn't even finished puberty, let alone Bud S. She's not a frog, she's Army, Lieutenant Graves cut in, his voice sharp, authoritative, and laced with distinct irritation. He walked into the circle, helmet tucked under his arm, his eyes scanning Elara with cold appraisal. He stopped 2 feet in front of her. He loomed. Elara snapped to attention, her expression flat. Lieutenant? Graves didn't return the courtesy. He leaned in, invading her personal space, smelling of tobacco and disapproval. You look at the manifest, Corporal? Yes, sir. Then you know this isn't a training op. We are going into Verdansk. It's non-permissive. No fire zones are tight. PID, positive identification, is mandatory. 1 bad shot, and CNN is broadcasting my team's court-martial by dinner. He paused, letting the silence stretch. Do you know how many confirmed kills the man standing next to you has? Elara glanced briefly at the sniper, a man named Miller, who was chewing gum and looking at the sky. No, sir. 42, Graves said. He's been doing this since you were in diapers. But Command says we need a low-signature observer for the North Sector. Someone small. Someone who can hide in a drainpipe. He sneered, the corner of his lip curling. Congratulations. You're small. That's your qualification. The platoon chuckled. It was a low, mean sound. Elara felt the flush of heat on her neck, but her heart rate didn't spike. It was her gift, or her curse. physiological bradycardia. Under stress, her pulse didn't race. It slowed. Her hands didn't shake. They turned to stone. "With respect, sir," Elara said, her voice quiet but carrying over the wind. "My qualification is the 6-inch grouping I put into a moving target at 1,200 meters during the selection trials at Fort Benning. The same trials where your low signature requirement washed out 3 of your guys." The laughter died instantly. Miller stopped chewing his gum. Sledge narrowed his eyes. Graves stared at her, his jaw tightening. For a second, Elara thought he might strike her. In the hierarchy of special operations, an attached support element talking back to a team leader was a death sentence for a career. "You got a mouth on you, girl," Graves hissed. "I have a rifle, sir," she corrected softly. "And I know how to use it. If you want me to carry your radio, I'll carry it. If you want me to stay on the bird, I'll stay. But if you put me in the tower, nothing touches your team. That's the job." Graves held her gaze for a long, uncomfortable moment. He was looking for fear. He found only a terrifying, vacant calm. "Load up," Graves barked, turning his back on her. "Miller, watch her. She freezes, you cut her loose. I'm not carrying a panicked teenager out of a kill zone." "Copy that, LT," Miller muttered, giving Elara a sideways glance that was no longer dismissive, but wary. Elara exhaled, hoisting her gear. She followed them up the ramp into the dark belly of the aircraft. They sat shoulder to shoulder, knees touching, but she was miles away. They saw a girl. They saw a liability. She checked the dope card taped to her rifle stock. Wind, elevation, Coriolis. Math didn't care about gender. Math didn't care about rank. And where they were going, the math was the only thing that was going to decide who lived. Time. 0200 Zulu, location, Varansk city limits, Sector 4. ROE, status yellow, self-defense only. The city of Varansk did not sleep, it rotted. Under the green-tinted gaze of Elara's PVS-31 night vision goggles, the ruins looked like the bottom of an aquarium, hazy, silent, and treacherous. "Bravo Actual, passing phase line Alpha, moving to target," Graves's voice crackled in her earpiece. The transmission was crystal clear, devoid of the heavy breathing that should have accompanied a 2-mile hump through urban debris. Elara gritted her teeth, adjusting the shoulder straps of her rucksack. The weight was a dull, constant scream in her lower back. 60 pounds of gear, rifle, spotting scope, ammo, batteries, tripod, water, on a 120-pound frame. Physics was a cruel master. She wasn't lagging, but she was burning calories at a rate the men ahead of her weren't. She watched the SEALs move. They flowed like oil through the wreckage of a bombed-out marketplace, their movements synchronized and predatory. They didn't look back. Not once. To them, she was a piece of equipment that had been deployed to a coordinate. Whether she got there was her problem. "Ghost, give me a status," Miller's voice cut in, slightly less abrasive than Graves, but tight with urgency. "Moving to the perch. ETA 5 mics," Elara whispered into her boom mic. "Make it 3. We're ahead of schedule." Elara looked up at the objective. The Cathedral of St. Peter loomed out of the darkness, a Gothic skeleton with half its roof sheared off by artillery fire years ago. The bell tower stood like a broken finger pointing at the moonless sky. It was the highest point in the sector. It was also a death trap. She reached the base of the tower and slipped through a gap in the masonry. The interior was a chasm of shadow. The stairs had been pulverized, leaving only a jagged spiral of stone hugging the walls, with gaps large enough to fall through. She began the climb. Every step was a calculation. test the stone, shift the weight, step. The dust coated her tongue, tasting of old mortar and copper. Her heart rate, usually so slow, thumped a steady, heavy rhythm against her ribs. Halfway up, the stairs ended. Elara froze. 10 feet of nothing but sheer, fire-scarred brick separated her from the next landing. She looked down. The ground was a black void 60 feet below. If she fell, the sound of her body hitting the floor would alert every militia fighter in a 3-block radius. "Ghost, we are holding at the breach point," Graves said, his voice dropping an octave. "We need eyes on. Now." "Almost there," she lied. She couldn't ask for help. Asking for help was admitting they were right. She unclipped her rifle case, securing it to a tagline on her belt to drag it behind her. She would have to free climb the interior wall using the rebar jutting out from the concrete like rusted ribs. Elara reached up, her gloved fingers closing around a piece of cold steel. She pulled. Her biceps burned, the lactic acid flooding her muscles. She kicked, her boot into a divot in the brick, finding purchase. She hauled herself up, inch by agonizing inch. Then the rebar groaned. It wasn't a loud sound, just the sick grind of metal yielding in concrete. She slipped. Her left foot scrambled for traction on the slick wall. The heavy ruck pulled her backward, gravity trying to peel her off the face of the tower. For a split second, she was weightless, suspended over the drop. Panic flared, a hot white spike in her chest. "Don't breathe." She forced the air out of her lungs, locking her core. She didn't grab wildly, she didn't scream. She simply froze, letting her body settle, trusting the friction of her right boot and the tenuous grip of her right hand. The rebar held, just barely. Slowly, terrifyingly slowly, she pulled herself up past the fail point, her muscles trembling with the effort. She rolled onto the upper landing, gasping for air, the sweat stinging her eyes inside the goggles. She lay there for 3 seconds, letting the adrenaline wash out, forcing her pulse back down into the 40s. "Ghost, sound off," Graves demanded. "Are you set?" Elara dragged herself to the window arch. She didn't stand. She crawled. She set up the tripod in the shadows, keeping the barrel of the MK-13 deep inside the room to hide the muzzle flash. She locked the heavy rifle into place and pressed her eye to the scope, switching from night vision to thermal. The world turned into a spectrum of grays and whites. "Ghost is set," she whispered, her voice steady as a flat line. "I have the courtyard." Below her, 400 meters away, the SEAL team was stacked up outside the compound gate. They looked like glowing white ghosts on her screen. "Copy. Executing breach in 3, 2... Wait," Elara said. The word was soft, but it stopped Graves cold. "Say again, Ghost?" Elara squinted. She adjusted the focus ring. The courtyard was empty. Too empty. But near the center, where an old fountain stood dry and cracked, the thermal image showed something faint. A heat bloom. Not a person. It was linear, like a vein running under the cobblestones. "I have a thermal anomaly in the courtyard," she said. "Sector center. Looks like disturbed earth. Residual heat. Someone dug there recently." "Intel said the courtyard was clear," Miller argued. "The ground is warmer than the air," Elara insisted. "It's fading, but it's there. It looks like a trench line that was filled in." Silence on the comms. The SEALs were impatient, aggressive dogs straining at the leash. They didn't like being told to wait by a girl who had probably just scraped her knees climbing a ladder. "Graves," she said, dropping the rank. "If you walk on that and it's a pressure plate loop, you're gone." A long pause. "Check it," Graves ordered Sledge. On her screen, she watched one of the white figures detach from the stack. He moved slowly toward the fountain, scanning with a mine detector. Elara held her breath. She watched the figure stop. He knelt. "Actual," Sledge's voice came back and tight. "She's right. I've got a disturbed patch here. Wires. It's an IED daisy chain. Massive. If we'd breached, we would have leveled the block." Elara exhaled, her cheek resting against the cold stock of the rifle. "Good catch, Ghost," Graves said. The tone wasn't grateful. It was surprised. "Hold cover. We're finding a secondary entry." She didn't answer. She just scanned the windows surrounding the courtyard. They had set a trap. And if they had set a trap, they were watching it. She shifted her scope to the building directly opposite the SEAL's position. 3rd floor. A window with a curtain that didn't move with the wind. "I see you," she whispered to the empty room. The game had started, and she was the only one who could see the board. Time, 0215 Zulu location, overwatch position Alpha, St. Peter's Tower. ROE, status red, contact imminent. The radio silence was heavy, but it wasn't the good kind. It wasn't the disciplined silence of professionals moving through the dark. It was the jagged, static-filled hiss of active jamming. Elara tapped her push-to-talk, PTT button. "Actual, this is Ghost. Radio check. Over." Nothing but white noise. Below her, the SEALs had pivoted away from the mined courtyard. They were stacking up along the eastern wall, moving toward a rusted iron gate that led into the adjacent alleyway. To the untrained eye, it was a smart flank. It bypassed the IED daisy chain she had spotted. But from her perch, 90 feet in the air, Elara could see the geometry of the slaughter. The alleyway was an L-shaped kill zone. She swung her scope to the rooftops lining the east side. Through the thermal imaging, she saw the heat signatures lying prone behind the parapets. Not 1 or 2. 6. And in the window directly facing the gate, the very gate Sledge was preparing to breach, a distinct, glowing tube shape rested on a windowsill. RPG-7, warhead attached. They weren't just waiting, they were baiting. The IED in the courtyard had been the shepherd, herding the wolves into the slaughterhouse. "Graves, hold position," Elara said, her voice rising despite her training. "Do not breach. It's a trap." Static. She checked her frequency. She checked her encryption key. Everything was correct. The jamming was local, likely a frantic, high-power device switched on as soon as the team entered the kill box. She watched Sledge raise his hand, counting down the breach. 3 fingers. 2. Elara's heart hammered against her ribs, defying her physiology. If Sledge kicked that gate, the RPG would vaporize him and the 3 men stacked behind him. She had less than 4 seconds. She traversed the rifle toward the RPG gunner. Problem. He was deep inside the room. She could see the heat of the weapon, but not the man's head or chest. If she took the shot and hit the wall, the enemy would fire immediately. If she missed, she gave away her position for nothing. Think. She couldn't kill the threat. She had to stop the target. She scanned the street level near the SEALs. 5 meters from the gate sat a derelict sedan, a relic of the pre-war city. It was battered, tires flat, but the hood was intact. ROE violation, firing without a visible hostile act, firing to endanger, firing without clearance. Consequence, court-martial, prison. Alternative, 4 folded flags and 4 widows. Elara shifted her aim. She didn't target the enemy. She targeted the silence. She dialed her elevation turret down. Range, 380 meters. Wind, negligible. She centered the crosshair on the sedan's engine block, right where the old alarm sensors would be fused into the wiring. "Forgive me," she whispered. She squeezed the trigger. The MK-13 bucked against her shoulder. The suppressor turned the explosion into a sharp, metallic hiss, like a whip cracking in a library. Flight time, 0.5 seconds. The bullet smashed into the sedan's hood. The metal shrieked, and instantly, the night was torn apart by the rhythmic, blaring wail of a car alarm. Honk, 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 honk. The effect was instantaneous. Down below, the SEALs flinched, weapons snapping up, sledge freezing mid-kick. They scattered, diving for cover against the wall, their breach interrupted by the sudden cacophony. Simultaneously, the enemy panicked. The RPG gunner in the window, spooked by the noise and assuming the assault had begun, fired prematurely. Whoosh! The rocket streaked out of the window, trailing a plume of gray smoke. But because the SEALs had scattered at the sound of the alarm, the warhead missed the cluster of men. It slammed into the iron gate, detonating in a brilliant orange fireball that shook the foundations of Elara's tower. "Contact front! Contact front!" The radio jamming wavered as the explosion likely disrupted the enemy's power source. Graves's voice broke through, distorted and furious. "Taking effective fire! Heavy machine gun at 12 o'clock!" The ambush was sprung, but the trap had failed. Instead of a massacre, it was a fight. Elara racked the bolt of her rifle, ejecting the spent casing. It chimed as it hit the stone floor. She didn't have time to feel relief. The muzzle flash of the RPG had revealed the gunner's position to everyone, but the machine gun teams on the roof were now opening up, pouring a river of tracer fire down into the alley where the SEALs were pinned. "Ghost! Status!" Graves roared, the sound of gunfire nearly drowning him out. "Did you take that shot?" "Negative on the hostile," Elara replied, her voice turning cold and detached again. She was back in the math now. "I initiated the alarm to halt your movement. You were walking into an L ambush." "You crazy b... I have targets." She cut him off. "Stand by." She shifted her aim back to the rooftops. The enemy gunners were focused on the alley, confident in their superiority. They didn't know the Angel of Death was sitting 400 meters above them, and she was no longer bound by the rules of silence. She found the first gunner, a PKM machine gun, the barrel glowing white-hot on her thermal scope. The shooter was prone, invisible to the SEALs below, but spread out like a map for her. "Target reference point. Rooftop, east side, corner building," she broadcasted. "Engaging!" She exhaled. The crosshair settled on the heat signature of the gunner's head. One shot. She sent it. The recoil was a shove. Through the scope, she saw the heat signature jerk violently and then go still. The stream of tracers from that position stopped instantly. "Splash one," she said, but there were 5 more, and now they knew where the bullet had come from. The tracers that had been pouring into the alley suddenly lifted, seeking her out. Red streaks of light zipped past her tower window, cracking the air like whips. "Ghost! You are taking fire! Displace!" Miller yelled. "Negative," Elara said, cycling the bolt again. "If I move, you lose overwatch. I'm clearing the lane." She wasn't a mascot anymore. She was the lightning rod, and she was going to burn everything down to keep them alive. Time: 218 Zulu location, overwatch position, Alpha ROE, status red, free fire. The alleyway had become a furnace. From her vantage point, Elara watched the battle unfold with the detached clarity of a surgeon witnessing a hemorrhage. The SEALs were no longer the apex predators of the battlefield. They were prey, huddled behind the thin sheet metal of the sedan and the crumbling masonry of the gate arch. The air was thick with the supersonic crack of 7.6 to 54 millimeters of rounds slamming into the pavement. The enemy PKM gunners on the rooftops weren't aiming for precision. They were painting the street with lead, creating a wall of death that made movement impossible. Man down! Man down! Medic! The call came through the radio, garbled by the roar of gunfire. On her thermal display, Elara saw the heat signature of a SEAL, call sign Viper, collapse. A bright white patch bloomed on his thigh. Arterial bleed. Suppressing! Sledge roared over the comms, his saw chugging in short, controlled bursts. But he was firing uphill at entrenched positions. He was losing. Elara cycled the bolt of her Mk-13. Her hands moved with a robotic efficiency that bypassed her conscious mind. Acquire, exhale, squeeze, recoil, cycle. She put a round through the chest of a gunman on the 3rd floor. He fell back into the room. Splash one. She shifted targets. Another shooter on a balcony. She fired. The bullet struck the concrete railing, sending Spall into his face. He ducked, suppressed. But for every head she forced down, 2 more popped up. The enemy had the high ground and the numbers. They were swarming the flanks, closing the net. "We can't move!" Graves shouted. "Ghost! I need you to shut down that heavy gun on the west roof! He's chewing us apart!" Elara swung the rifle toward the west roof. The PKM position was well fortified, set behind a wall of sandbags with only the barrel protruding. She put a 300 Win Mag round into the sandbags. Dust puffed up. The gunner didn't stop. He was blind firing, protected by inches of packed earth. "Negative effect on target," Elara reported, her voice flat. "He's dug in. I can't get an angle." "Find a way, or we're dead in 30 seconds." She watched Viper being dragged by Sledge, leaving a smear of heat on the cold asphalt. They were trying to reach a storefront 10 meters away, but the machine gun fire was a physical barrier. If they crossed that open ground, they would be cut in half. Elara pulled her eye from the scope for a fraction of a second, scanning the environment. Killing the gunner was impossible. Stopping the gun was impossible. Change the equation. Her gaze snapped to the building directly above the SEAL's position. It was an old cinema, its facade rotting, hanging precariously over the alley, suspended by rusted chains and steel cables, was a massive, vertical neon sign. It was dead now. A skeletal grid of metal and glass letters that read Kino in Cyrillic. It hung directly between the rooftop machine gunners and the SEALs. If she shot the enemy, the gun would be manned by another soldier in seconds. If she shot the sign, "Graves, move your team to the storefront. On my mark," Elara said. "Are you deaf? We can't cross." "Trust me," she whispered. 3, 2, 1. She didn't aim at a person. She aimed at the stress point, the rusted steel turnbuckle holding the main cable of the sign to the building's anchor. It was a 4-inch piece of steel 400 meters away. She factored the spin drift. She ignored the tracers zipping past her own window. The world narrowed down to that single rusted bolt. Bang! The heavy bullet struck the turnbuckle with the force of a sledgehammer. Sparks showered down like fireworks. The metal groaned, stretched, and then, snap. The cable whipped through the air. Gravity took over. The multi-ton sign groaned, tearing free from the masonry. It plummeted, not crashing to the ground, but swinging down like a giant guillotine blade. It slammed into the alley floor with a deafening, earth-shaking crash, kicking up a massive cloud of dust and debris. Crucially, it landed upright, wedged between the buildings, creating a sudden, 20-foot-high wall of steel and glass between the SEALs and the enemy gunners. The firing stopped. The sudden obstruction baffled the enemy. The line of sight was broken. "Move! Go! Go! Go!" Graves screamed. Under the cover of the dust cloud and the new barricade, the thermal signatures of the SEALs surged forward. Sledge dragged Viper. The rest of the team provided rear security. They disappeared into the storefront, out of the kill zone. Elara watched them vanish into the hard cover. She exhaled, a long, shuddering breath that emptied her lungs. Her heart rate was sitting at 52 beats per minute. "Status?" she asked. There was a pause, a long pause. "We're clear," Graves said. His voice was different now. The anger was gone, replaced by a confused, grudging shock. "We're inside. Viper's stable. Tourniquet applied." "Copy," Elara said. "I'm shifting sectors." "Ghost," Graves cut in. "That sign? Did you rig that?" "Physics, Lieutenant," she replied, reloading a fresh magazine. "Kinetic energy versus structural integrity. It was the only way to break the line of sight." "Roger that," Graves murmured. "Good effect on target." She didn't smile. She didn't feel pride. She felt the vibration of footsteps on the stairs below her. While she had been busy playing guardian angel, the enemy had sent a hunting party. She pulled the rifle into her shoulder, turning away from the window toward the heavy wooden door of the bell tower. "Bravo, Actual. I have footsteps in my stairwell," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I'm going dark." She wasn't safe. She was trapped in a stone box, and the wolves were at the door. Time: 2-5 Zulu location, overwatch position, Alpha ROE, status red. The footsteps in the stairwell had stopped. For now. Elara jammed a rubber door wedge, standard issue, usually for keeping barracks doors open, under the heavy iron reinforced door of the bell tower. It wouldn't stop a breach, but it would buy her 3 seconds. And in her world, 3 seconds was a lifetime. She returned to the rifle. The war below hadn't paused for her fear. "Actual, be advised," Elara said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "I have a high-value target in the building north of your position. 3rd floor. He's on a radio. I can see the antenna." "Take him out, Ghost," Graves replied, his breathing heavy. The SEALs were regrouping inside the storefront, reloading magazines and patching up Viper. "If he brings in technicals on our 6, we're done." Elara traversed the scope. She found the window. The room was lit by the flickering orange cast of a fire burning in the street below. Through her thermal sight, the figures were stark and undeniable. The target was smart. He wasn't standing in the open. He was pressed tight against the window frame, and he was holding something in front of him. A smaller heat signature. A woman. She was struggling, her hands clawing at the man's arm, but he held her tight, using her body as a plate of living armor. He knew there was a sniper. He was betting his life on the sniper's morality. "Target is obstructed," Elara reported. "He's using a civilian shield. Female. I don't have a clean line." "Ghost. That man is calling in a QRF, quick reaction force. If that truck arrives, we lose the team. Do you understand?" Graves's voice was desperate. "Clear the threat." "I have a civilian in the optic, Graves. I cannot take the shot." "Then find another angle. Do it!" Elara stared at the image. The man was shouting into his radio handset. In 10 seconds, maybe 15, the call would be completed. She zoomed in. The optics of the Night Force scope were impeccable. She could see the heat radiating from the brickwork of the building. Geometry. The man was standing behind the woman, but his body wasn't perfectly aligned. He was leaning slightly to his right, pressing his back against the interior wall next to the window frame for stability. He thought the wall protected him. He thought the brick was cover. Elara looked at her dope card. Range, 410 meters. Ammo, MK248 Mod 1 300 Winchester Magnum, 220 grain projectile. Velocity, sufficient. Barrier, standard Soviet-era cinder block and plaster. It wasn't cover, it was concealment. If she shot the woman, the bullet would pass through her and kill him. That was the easy shot. That was the shot a monster would take. If she shot the wall... Physics, she muttered to herself, the mantra of her survival. The bullet would lose energy passing through the brick. It might fragment. It might deflect. But if she hit the mortar line, the seam between the blocks, the resistance would be minimal. She shifted her crosshair away from the woman's head. She moved it 6 inches to the right, aiming at the blank gray wall next to the window. To an observer, she was aiming at nothing. "Vance, engage or stand down!" Graves barked. Elara didn't blink. She visualized the man's torso behind the opaque barrier. She visualized the heart beating behind the ribs, shielded by the masonry. Heart rate 48 BPM, breath held. She squeezed. Crack. The rifle slammed back. The suppressor hissed. Through the scope, she watched the wall explode. A puff of dust and brick chips erupted from the impact point. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. The woman in the window stood frozen. Then, the man behind her crumpled. The heavy 300 Win Mag slug had punched through the cinder block, expanded, and torn through his lateral chest wall. The physics were brutal. He didn't drop the radio. His hand simply ceased to function. He slid down the wall, leaving a streak of heat on the thermal display. The woman, suddenly released, fell to her knees, scrambling away into the darkness of the room. "Target down," Elara whispered. Her hands were trembling now, just a little. Did you shoot through the hostage?" Graves asked, his voice low. He couldn't see the wall from his angle. He only saw the result. "Negative," Elara said, cycling the bolt. "I shot the building. The building killed him." Silence. The SEALs were hardened killers. They understood violence. But this cold, mathematical application of force, this ability to see through walls and calculate density in the middle of a firefight, was something else. It was unnatural. "Copy that, Ghost," Graves said finally. The sneer was gone from his voice. In its place was something colder. Fear. "Good effect. We're moving." Elara let out the breath she had been holding. She felt sick. The nausea rolled in her gut, hot and sour. She had gambled a woman's life on a calculation of brick density. She had been right, but being right didn't make her feel human. She wiped the sweat from her eyes. Scrape. The sound came from the door. Not a footstep this time, a testing of the handle. The wedge held the door firm, but the handle turned slowly, then released. Elara froze. She slowly withdrew the Glock 19 from the holster on her chest rig. She couldn't watch the street anymore. The war had come into the tower. "Graves," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I have contact at my position. I'm compromising my cover to engage. You are on your own for the next 5 mics. "Ghost, say again?" She didn't answer. She set the rifle down and turned to face the door, raising the pistol. The handle turned again. Someone was on the other side, and they weren't knocking. Time, WO 240, Zulu location, overwatch position Alpha ROE, status red. Steer to the handle of the bell tower door jiggled again, metallic, insistent. Elara lay prone in the dust, the Glock 19 aimed steadily at the wood. Her breathing was so shallow it barely moved her chest rig. 1 beat, 2 beats. Jammed, a muffled voice said in Arabic. Forget it. Roof is clear. Move up. The sound of boots retreated, heavy footsteps echoing down the stone spiral. They hadn't tried to breach. Why would they? The tower was dark, silent, and the door was warped with age. To them, it was just another locked room in a city of ruins. Elara didn't lower the pistol until the footsteps faded completely into the ambient roar of the battle outside. Only then did she holster the sidearm and drag herself back to the rifle. She was safe from the patrol. She was not safe from the hunter. Through the scope, the battlefield had changed. The chaotic spray of militia fire had settled into a rhythmic, probing siege. The SEALs were dug in at the storefront, but they weren't moving. Elara scanned the sector to the west, the only area she hadn't cleared. She stopped, in a bombed-out hotel, 300 meters away and slightly elevated relative to the street. A shadow moved inside a room. It wasn't the frantic, jerky movement of an insurgent. It was slow, liquid. She dialed up the magnification. 2 men, 1 spotter with high-powered binos, 1 shooter with a Dragunov SVU, the bullpup variant, compact, designed for urban work. They weren't looking at the SEALs. They were looking at her tower. Flash traffic, Elara whispered, barely moving her lips. Graves, you have a counter-sniper team in the hotel. Grid 8842, level 4. Can you neutralize? Graves asked immediately. Elara's finger hovered over the trigger. The crosshair was resting on the enemy sniper's shoulder. It was an easy shot, a mechanical certainty. But then she saw the 3rd man, on the roof of the hotel, directly above the sniper team. An RPG crew was setting up. They were scanning for muzzle flashes. They were waiting for the ghost to speak so they could silence her with a thermobaric rocket. If she fired now, she killed the sniper. But the RPG would hit her tower before she could cycle the bolt. Negative, Elara said. If I fire, I'm compromised. I have heavy ordnance looking for my flash. Ghost, that sniper is pinning us down. He doesn't see you yet. He's looking for me, Elara corrected. He knows I'm high up. He's hunting the overwatch. She watched the enemy sniper scan the windows of her tower. His optic passed over her loophole. She held her breath, willing her body temperature to blend with the cold stone floor, praying her thermal signature was masked by the depth of the room. He paused. He looked right at her, or rather, at the darkness where she lay. It was a staring contest with death. If she moved, the glint of her lens would betray her. If she flinched, the motion would draw his eye. Don't move. Her muscles screamed. A cramp began to knot in her right calf, a sharp, twisting pain. She ignored it. She dissociated from the pain, turning her body into an object. I am stone. I am dust. The enemy sniper waited 5 seconds. Then he shifted his aim. He lowered his rifle, looking down toward the street where the SEALs were huddled. He had decided the tower was empty. Elara exhaled, a microscopic release of air. He's shifting to you, Elara whispered. Keep your heads down. I'm letting him set up. You're letting him what? Sledge hissed. Drop him. No, Elara said, her mind racing through the tactical geometry. He thinks he owns the high ground. He's confident. When he starts shooting at you, the RPG team will relax. They'll look at his target, not mine. You're using us as bait, Graves stated. It wasn't a question. I'm buying an opening, she replied coldly. Wait for his first shot. The enemy sniper settled into his firing position. He was comfortable. He had no idea that 300 meters away, a teenage girl had already calculated the windage required to end his life. She wasn't just hiding anymore. She was stalking. She watched him rack the bolt of the Dragunov. "Get ready," she said. The wait was the hardest part. It was the silence before the thunder. And in that silence, Elara realized something terrifying. She didn't feel fear anymore. She felt patience. Time. Platoon Zulu location, overwatch position, Alpha ROE, status red, the crack of the enemy. Dragunov was the starter pistol. Below, the street erupted. The enemy sniper's round sparked off the pavement inches from Sledge's boot, sending the EA SEAL team into a frenzy of movement. But Elara couldn't fire back. The RPG crew on the hotel roof was still scanning, their heads turning toward the sound of the sniper's shot, looking for a counterfire that never came. "Suppressing! Moving!" Graves's voice tore through the comms. Elara watched helplessly as the heat signatures of the platoon surged forward. They weren't retreating. They were breaking contact. They bounded across the street, using the chaos she had predicted to slip into the labyrinth of alleys to the south. "Graves, hold! You're moving into dead ground!" Elara hissed, pressing the radio PTT. "I lose visual in 20 meters. Do not cross the intersection." "We can't stay here, Ghost. We're taking heavy mortar fire." Graves shouted back. "We are pushing to Rally Point Bravo. Get your head down." Then they crossed the line. One by one, the white ghosts of the SEALs flickered and vanished behind the bulk of a warehouse complex. The thermal image of the street emptied. The enemy sniper fired again, then realized his targets were gone. He began shouting orders to the RPG team. Elara sat alone in the dark. The battle was moving away from her. The roar of gunfire grew distant, muffled by the layers of concrete and stone between her and the team. "Actual, this is Ghost," she said. "I have lost visual, requesting sitrep." Static. "Actual, do you copy?" Nothing but the rhythmic hiss-pop of the jamming attempting to reassert itself. Then, a faint transmission broke through. Likely a localized comms between the SEALs that she wasn't meant to hear clearly. "Everyone accounted for?" Graves's voice. "All up. Sledge is limping but mobile." "Good. Push to the river. We leave this hellhole in 10 mics." Elara froze. Everyone accounted for. They weren't counting her. She stared at the radio. It wasn't a mistake. In the heat of the breakout, in the adrenaline of survival, they had reverted to their core unit. The men who trained together, ate together, and bled together. She was the attachment, the external asset, the mascot. If she stayed in the tower, she was safe. She had water. She had ammo. She could wait for the sun to rise, blend in with the ruins, and call for a solo extraction in 24 hours. That was the smart play. That was the survivalist play. The SEALs were moving blindly toward the river. They didn't know that the bridge, the only way across, was a choke point. She had seen the mine layers there 2 hours ago. If she stayed, she lived. And they died. "They left me," she whispered to the empty room. The words tasted like ash. It shouldn't have hurt. She knew the deal. She knew the hierarchy. But the pain was sharp and sudden, a betrayal that cut deeper than the fear of the enemy. She looked at the MK-13. Heavy, cumbersome, a burden in a foot race. She grabbed the drag bag. She didn't pack it nicely. She shoved the spotting scope in, threw the batteries on top, and zipped it shut with a violent yank. "Fine," she muttered, her eyes burning. "Leave me. But you aren't dying on my watch, you son of a bitch." She slung the rifle across her back, the barrel pointing down. She tightened her chest rig. She checked the Glock. She wasn't going to hide. She was going to hunt them down. Elara moved to the window, took one last look at the RPG team still scanning the wrong rooftop, and then turned to the stairs. She wasn't the ghost anymore. She was just a girl with a gun, running into a city that wanted to eat her alive. The descent was faster than the climb. She slid down the railing where the stairs were broken, her boots slamming onto the stone with reckless force. She burst out of the tower's base into the alleyway. The air smelled of sewage and cordite. The silence here was heavy, menacing. She checked her compass. Rally Point Bravo, the river. She started to run. Time. Jo 310 Zulu location. Varansk River Valley, South Bridge ROE, status red. Elara's lungs were burning. The air in the river valley was colder, sharper, cutting through her throat like broken glass. She had sprinted 6 blocks, navigating piles of rubble and twisted rebar, carrying a load that was half her body weight. She skidded to a halt behind the remains of a toll booth, chest heaving. 300 meters ahead, the Varansk River cut through the city like a black scar. Spanning it was the old bridge, a stone arch structure that had somehow survived the shelling. It was the only way out of Sector 4, and it was a graveyard. Through her scope, she saw them. The SEALs were moving fast, a tight wedge formation sprinting for the bridge. Mortar rounds were beginning to walk down the street behind them, driving them forward like cattle. Graves was on point, his rifle up, eyes scanning the far bank for targets. He wasn't looking at his feet. Elara adjusted her focus. The bridge deck was littered with debris, but her thermal optic picked up the telltale signs she had noted hours ago during her initial scan. Patches of ground that were slightly cooler than the surrounding stone. Dig sites, pressure plates. "Graves, stop!" she screamed into the radio. "Do not cross! It's mined!" Static. The jamming was intense down here in the valley, bouncing off the canyon walls. "Actual! Mines! Stop!" He didn't slow down. He was 10 meters from the first trigger. 5 meters. He was going to die. They were all going to die. Elara dropped to the prone position, the wet gravel digging into her stomach. She deployed the bipod legs, slamming them into the dirt to load the rifle. Range, 320 meters. Wind, left to right, 15 miles per hour, full value. The wind was howling off the water, strong enough to push a bullet 6 inches off course at this distance. If she aimed at the ground in front of him and missed left, the bullet would fly harmlessly into the river. If she missed right, she would shatter his shin or femoral artery. She had to put a bullet between his feet and the mine, a target window of 4 inches. She dialed 2.5 MOA right windage. Graves was running. His boot was rising, about to descend on the slab of concrete that hid the crush wire circuit. "Don't move," she whispered, tears of strain blurring her vision for a nanosecond before she blinked them away. She held just left of his leading boot. Exhale. Squeeze. Boom. The rifle roared, the sound echoing flatly against the water. The bullet tore through the air, battling the crosswind. It struck the pavement exactly 8 inches in front of Graves's descending foot. Crack zing. Concrete spall erupted like a grenade. The supersonic snap of the bullet passing inches from his leg was unmistakable. Graves reacted with the instincts of a cat. He threw himself backward, diving flat onto the deck, his weapon snapping around to face the rear. "Sniper! Rear! Taking fire!" Sledge yelled, spinning around and unleashing a burst of saw fire into the darkness, directly over Elara's head. The rounds zipped past her, snapping branches on the tree above the toll booth. She didn't flinch. She kept her eye on the scope. "Hold fire! Hold fire!" Graves's voice cut through the chaos, amplified by the external speakers of his headset. Graves was lying on his stomach, staring at the ground where the bullet had impacted. A smoking crater in the concrete. And 3 inches past the crater, partially exposed by the spall, was the glint of copper wire and the dull gray casing of a 150mm artillery shell rigged as an IED. Graves froze. He looked at the wire. He looked at his boot. Then, slowly, he turned his head to look back toward the city, toward the toll booth. He tapped his radio. "Check fire," Graves said, his voice trembling slightly. "Check fire." That wasn't a hostile. The SEALs lowered their weapons, confusion rippling through the formation. "Ghost?" Graves asked. The transmission was clearer now, line of sight established. "Ghost, is that you?" Elara keyed her mic. Her hands were shaking now. The adrenaline dump was hitting her hard. "Watch your step, Lieutenant," she breathed. "The bridge is rigged. Stay on the rivets. Walk in the tire tracks of the last vehicle." Graves stared at the darkness where she lay hiding. He pushed himself up slowly, avoiding the wire. "You're not in the tower," he said. It was a realization, not a question. "You came down." "You left the kill zone," she replied, her voice steadying. "I couldn't cover you from the nest, so I moved." There was a silence on the net that felt heavier than the mortar fire. Sledge looked at Graves. Miller looked at the bridge. They realized 2 things simultaneously. 1, she had just saved the entire platoon from vaporization. 2, she had sprinted through a war zone alone to do it. "Roger that," Graves said softly. "Clear. The bridge. Single file. Follow my steps." Elara didn't get up. She stayed behind the scope, watching over them until every man had stepped over the wire. She had earned their lives. Again. But as she packed up her rifle to follow, she realized something else. They feared the enemy. But now, just a little bit, they feared her too. No 18-year-old should be able to make that shot. Time, 0315 Zulu location, South Bridge Toll Station, Overwatch. ROE, status red. The SEALs were halfway across the bridge, moving with agonizing slowness, stepping in the exact footprints of the man in front of them to avoid the pressure plates. They were sitting ducks. Elara lay in the prone position behind the toll booth, her rifle barrel resting on a sandbag she had dragged from a collapsed bunker. She wasn't watching the bridge anymore. She was watching the road on the far side of the river. The geography of the valley was a bowl. She was on the north rim, the team was in the center, and on the south rim, a cloud of dust was rising against the moonlight. "Contact south!" Miller shouted over the net. "Vehicle! Fast mover!" Through her optic, Elara saw it. A Toyota Land Cruiser, stripped of its doors, suspension lifted, tearing down the switchback road that led to the bridge's exit. Mounted in the bed was a DSHK 12.7mm heavy machine gun. The gunner was already swinging the massive weapon toward the bridge. "We're exposed," Graves yelled. "Sledge, set up, punch it!" "Range is too far," Sledge screamed back. "I can't hit a mover at 1,000 yards with a saw." The truck was 200 meters from Elara's position. It was closing the distance to the bridge exit at 40 miles per hour. If it reached the end of the bridge, it would block the exit and rake the entire span with armor-piercing incendiary rounds. The SEALs had nowhere to run. They were trapped between the mines and the machine gun. Elara checked her scope. The magnification was maxed out at 25x. The truck looked like a toy. Range, 1,200 meters. Flight time, 1.8 seconds. Target speed, 40 mph, approx 18 meters per second. Lead required, 32 meters. She had to aim 32 meters in front of the truck. She had to shoot at empty space and trust that the truck would arrive at the bullet's destination at the exact same moment. "Ghost, take the driver," Graves ordered. "Negative," Elara murmured, her voice detached. "Windshield glare, suspension bounce, low probability." "Then kill the truck. Kill it now!" Elara shifted her aim. She wasn't looking at the driver. She was visualizing the engine block, a chunk of cast iron sitting between the front wheels. A single round might crack it, but the momentum would carry the truck forward. She needed to shatter it. She needed a double tap, at 1,200 meters, on a moving target. It was statistically impossible. She breathed in. The world slowed down. The sound of the wind, the panicked voices on the radio, the thumping of her own heart. It all faded into a white hum. Lead, hold, flow. She placed the reticle far ahead of the truck, leading it into a patch of darkness, shot one. The rifle roared. She didn't wait for the impact. She racked the bolt, clack, clack, cycling the action with a violence that bruised her palm. She reacquired the sight picture. The truck was still moving. Shot two. She fired again. 2 rounds of .300 Winchester Magnum were now in the air, flying in a high arc over the river valley, separated by less than a second. Elara held the recoil, watching through the scope. 1 second. 1.5 seconds. The truck kept driving. The gunner racked the charging handle of the DSHK. "It's not stopping," Sledge yelled. Then physics arrived. The first bullet slammed into the front grille, punching through the radiator and cracking the engine block. The second bullet, following the same trajectory, smashed into the compromised metal, shattering the pistons. The engine seized instantly. The front wheels locked up as the transmission imploded. At 40 miles per hour, the sudden stop was catastrophic. The truck didn't just stop, it somersaulted. The rear end lifted, flipping the vehicle end over end in a violent spray of glass and metal. The gunner was thrown clear, ragdolling into the air. The truck rolled 3 times, crashing into the ditch 10 meters from the bridge exit. A fireball erupted as the fuel tank ruptured. On the bridge, the SEALs flinched at the visual explosion. They saw the truck die. They saw the fire. Then, 3 seconds later, the sound reached them. Crack, crack, and finally, the distant rolling thunder of Elara's rifle from the north rim. "Target destroyed," Elara whispered. Her shoulder throbbed with a dull ache. "Bridge exit is clear." Silence on the comms. Absolute stunned silence. "Did she?" Miller started, then trailed off. "That was over a click away, moving." "Move," Graves said, his voice quiet. "Don't look at it. Just move." Elara watched them sprint the last 50 meters, stepping over the wire, running past the burning wreckage of the technical. They were safe. She rolled onto her back, staring up at the stars. Her hands were shaking uncontrollably now. The crash was over. The flow state was gone. She felt small, cold, and incredibly old. "Ghost to actual," she keyed the mic. "I'm displacing to join you. Don't leave without me this time." "We're waiting, Ghost," Graves replied. "We're not going anywhere." For the first time, he called her by her call sign with something that sounded like reverence. But Elara didn't care about their respect. She just wanted the shaking to stop. Time, 0330 Zulu location, North Bank Toll Complex, ROE, status red. The shot that killed the truck had been a statement. It was also a beacon. Elara knew the physics of sound. That thunderclap from her MK-13 had pinpointed her location to anyone with ears within 3 miles. She couldn't stay at the toll booth. She had to move, and she had to move now. She scrambled backward, dragging the rifle bag into the shadows of the ruined administrative building attached to the toll station. Her goal was the basement level, a maintenance tunnel that ran under the road and popped out near the riverbank. It was the only way to rejoin the SEALs without crossing open ground. She entered the hallway. It was narrow, littered with office debris and shattered glass. She moved fast, her weapon slung over her shoulder to keep her hands free for the Glock 19 pressed against her chest. In the open, at 1,000 meters, she was a predator. In here, in the claustrophobic dark, she was prey. She reached the stairwell door. She paused, listening. Scuff. Leather on concrete, below her. It wasn't the rhythmic march of a squad. It was the hesitant, shuffling movement of stragglers. The militia fighters who had been routing from the bridge were falling back into this building. Elara's heart slammed against her ribs. She was alone. She had a bolt-action rifle that was useless in a hallway and a pistol with 15 rounds. She slowly pushed the door open. 3 men were on the landing below, illuminated by the beam of a cheap flashlight. They were arguing in rapid Arabic, gesturing toward the roof. They knew she was up there. They were coming to collect the bounty. Elara stepped back, but her boot crunched on a piece of drywall. The flashlight snapped up. The beam blinded her. Huna! Kanas! Here! Sniper! There was no time for math, no time for windage. Elara dropped to a knee as the first AK-47 opened up. The rounds chewed into the doorframe inches from her head, spraying her with wood splinters and concrete dust. The noise in the enclosed stairwell was deafening, a physical blow to the eardrums. She extended the Glock and fired blindly into the light. Bang, bang, bang. The flashlight shattered. A man screamed, but they were rushing her. She could hear the heavy thud of boots charging up the stairs. She was 120 pounds. If they got hands on her, it was over. She fumbled for the pouch on her belt. Her fingers, slick with sweat, closed around the cold steel pin of an M84 stun grenade. She yanked the pin. She didn't count. She just threw it over the railing and buried her face in the crook of her elbow. Flash bang. The explosion sucked the air out of the stairwell. Even with her eyes closed, the light seared her retinas red. The sound was a concussive slap that rattled her teeth. The screaming below turned into disoriented moans. Move! Elara lunged forward, vaulting over the railing to the landing below. She landed awkwardly, her ankle rolling, but she kept moving. She saw shapes staggering in the smoke. Men clutching their eyes, ears bleeding. She didn't stop to finish them. She shoulder-checked the fire exit door, bursting out into the night air. Crack. A single shot rang out from the darkness behind her. One of the fighters had recovered faster than the others. Elara felt a hot, stinging whip crack across her left upper arm. It didn't feel like pain at first. It felt like being struck by a hot poker. She stumbled, gasping, but momentum carried her forward. She tumbled down the embankment, sliding through mud and trash until she hit the concrete lip of the maintenance tunnel. She scrambled inside, collapsing against the wet wall. Ghost! Report! Graves's voice was in her ear, tinny and panicked. We heard a detonation at your pass. Elara looked at her arm. The sleeve of her combat shirt was torn. Dark blood was already soaking the fabric, slick and black in the moonlight. It was a graze, deep, tearing through the tricep muscle, but it hadn't hit the bone. She bit her lip to keep from sobbing. The pain was arriving now, a throbbing, sickening pulse. I'm clear, she gasped, pressing her hand over the wound. Contact. Close quarters. Disengaged. Are you hit? She looked at the blood dripping onto her boots. If she told him she was hit, He would send the team back. They would walk into the kill zone to carry her. Negative, she lied, her voice trembling. Just scraped. Equipment malfunction. I'm moving to the rendezvous. Copy. We are holding the bridgehead. Get here, Ghost. Fast. Elara pulled a pressure dressing from her IFAC, individual first aid kit, with one hand. She used her teeth to rip the packaging. She wrapped the bandage tight around her bicep, cinching it until the world grayed out for a second. She checked the Glock. 3 rounds left in the mag. She holstered it. She reached for the MK-13. The heavy rifle was still strapped to her back, miraculously undamaged. But as she tried to lift it, her left arm spasmed and gave out. She stared at the limb. It was weak, shaking. She was a sniper. Her left arm was her support. It was the stability for the rifle. Without it, she couldn't hold the weapon steady. Improvise, she whispered through gritted teeth. She tightened the rifle sling, wrapping it around her forearm like a tourniquet to lock the weapon against her body. It would hurt. It would bleed. But it would hold. She pushed herself up. The tunnel stretched out before her, dark and dripping. She wasn't the invincible phantom anymore. She was wounded, cornered, and terrified. But the team was waiting. Elara Vance limped into the dark, trailing drops of blood on the concrete. Time, 0345 Zulu, location, maintenance access tunnel, Riverbank ROE, status black, imminent threat to life, ROE fluid. Elara dragged herself out of the tunnel mouth and collapsed behind a concrete flood barrier. Her left arm was a dead weight, throbbing with a hot, rhythmic agony that synced with her heartbeat. The makeshift tourniquet she had rigged with her rifle sling was tight, but the blood was still seeping through, slick and warm against her side. She forced herself up. She rested the barrel of the M13 on the concrete lip of the wall. She didn't have the strength to hold the forend, so she jammed the bipod legs into the mossy cracks of the stone to lock it in place. She looked down the riverbank. The SEALs had established a defensive semicircle at the base of the bridge. They were disciplined, lethal, and ready. But they were facing something their training hadn't prepared them for. It wasn't a squad. It was a tide. Pouring out of the main street from the city center was a mob. Hundreds of them. Some were militia fighters with AKs raised high, screaming orders. But the front ranks were civilians. Youths with rocks, men with pipes, people caught up in the hysteria of the burning city. They were being pushed forward by the fighters behind them, a human shield of rage. "Back off! Get back!" Graves's voice boomed over the external speakers of the MRAP vehicle they had commandeered at the bridge. "We will fire!" The mob didn't stop. They surged forward, a chaotic wave of noise and torches. "Actual, they aren't stopping," Miller shouted. "I have civilians in the front. I can't rake the crowd." "Hold fire," Graves ordered. "Precision only. Don't create a massacre." Elara watched through her scope. The SEALs were trapped by their own morality. If they opened up with the saws, they would kill dozens of unarmed rioters to get to the gunmen. It would be a war crime televised globally. But if they didn't shoot, the mob would overrun them in 30 seconds, beating them to death with bricks and capturing them for videos that would be far worse. Elara's breath hitched. The pain in her arm sharpened her focus into a singular razor-edged point. She couldn't kill the crowd. There were too many. She had to break their will. "Physics," she whispered, "and psychology." She shifted her aim. She didn't target the chests or heads of the militia leaders in the back. She targeted the legs of the men leading the charge, the loud ones, the ones fueling the momentum. Range, 200 meters. Target, patella, the kneecap. She fired. Crack. The lead rioter, a man in a green jacket waving a machete, didn't die. His right leg simply vanished from under him. The 300 Win Mag round, designed to penetrate engine blocks, shattered the bone into powder. He collapsed screaming, tumbling forward into the dirt. The mob hesitated for a fraction of a second, then surged over him. Elara fired again. Crack. Another man, 2 steps to the left. His knee exploded. He went down, thrashing wildly, his screams piercing the chanting. Elara didn't stop. She worked the bolt with a terrifying mechanical rhythm. Rack, fire, rack, fire. She wasn't shooting to kill. She was building a wall. She dropped the 3rd man, then the 4th, then the 5th. Within 10 seconds, the front line of the mob wasn't a charging force anymore. It was a pile of writhing, screaming bodies. The men behind them tripped over the wounded. The momentum of the charge shattered against a barrier of human misery. The psychological effect was instant and devastating. Death in combat is sudden. Men drop and are still. But this was different. The sight of their leaders screaming, clutching, shattered limbs, the wet, visceral horror of the injuries. It broke the hysteria. The chanting stopped. The mob recoiled. The civilians at the front frantically backpedaled, terrified that they would be next. The militia in the back tried to push them forward, but the wall of fear was impenetrable. "Cease fire! Cease fire!" Graves yelled, but no one on his team was shooting. The SEALs stood behind their barricades, weapons lowered slightly, watching the carnage unfold with a mixture of relief and horror. They looked up at the muzzle flashes coming from the riverbank wall. Elara fired one last shot, not at a person, but into the asphalt directly in front of the hesitant crowd. A final warning. The mob broke. They dropped their rocks and ran, fleeing back into the shadows of the city, leaving the wounded writhing in the street. Silence returned to the bridgehead, broken only by the moans of the men Elara had crippled. "Jesus Christ," Sledge whispered over the comms. "Who is doing that?" Elara leaned back against the concrete wall. Her vision swam. The recoil had jarred her wounded arm with every shot, sending fresh waves of blood soaking into her shirt. She felt nauseous. She felt like a butcher. She keyed the mic. Her voice was a husk. "Perimeter secure," she said. "Hostiles dispersed." "Ghost?" Graves asked. His voice was guarded. Were you shooting for the legs?" "Fatalities would have escalated the situation," she replied, the logic cold and hollow in her own ears. "I denied them the avenue of approach. They won't come back." There was a long pause. The SEALs were looking at the men on the ground, men who would never walk again. They were alive, yes, but the brutality of the method hung in the air like smoke. "Copy that," Graves said finally. He sounded tired. He sounded wary. "Good work, Ghost. But, damn." Elara closed her eyes. She didn't want their praise. She didn't want their pity. She just wanted the extraction bird to land so she could stop being this person. She checked her magazine. 2 rounds left. "Actual," she said. "I'm coming in. Don't shoot the girl limping out of the tunnel." "We see you," Graves said. "Come on home." She pushed herself off the wall. She was the hero of the hour. But as she walked toward the lights of the bridge, she knew that when they looked at her now, they wouldn't see the 18-year-old girl anymore. They would see the person who could look through a scope and decide exactly how much a human being needed to suffer to save the mission. Time 0400 Zulu, location, South Bridgehead, LZ Bravo, ROWECHA, status black. Elara stumbled into the circle of white light created by the SEAL's weapon lights. She looked like a specter rising from the grave. Her combat shirt was soaked black with blood on the left side. Her face was caked in gray limestone dust, and her eyes were two dark, hollow pits that seemed to look right through the men standing before her. Sledge stepped forward, his massive frame hesitating. He looked at the blood dripping from her sleeve, then at the rifle strapped to her chest. "Ghost?" he asked, his voice unusually soft. "Status," she croaked. It wasn't a request. It was a reflex. "LZ is marked," Graves said, stepping into her view. He didn't look at her wound. He looked at her eyes, searching for the girl he had dismissed on the tarmac. He didn't find her. "Bird is inbound. ETA 2 mics. We need to get you stabilized." "No time," Elara whispered, leaning heavily against the concrete jersey barrier. She fumbled for her magazine pouch. Empty. She checked the dump pouch. She found one partial magazine she had swapped out hours ago. It felt light. 2 rounds, maybe 3 if she was lucky. "Valkyrie 1-6, this is Bravo Actual," the radio crackled. "LZ is hot, mark with IR." "Copy, Valkyrie, strobes are active." The thumping rhythm of rotors began to vibrate in Elara's chest. It was a beautiful, heavy sound, the sound of survival. But as the noise grew, so did the danger. A helicopter coming into a hover was the most vulnerable target on the battlefield. It was a loud, slow, fragile piñata. Elara didn't look at the sky. She looked at the rooftops. The bridgehead was surrounded by 3-story tenements. Dark windows, flat roofs, perfect for an ambush. "Graves," she said, her voice straining. "The roofs. Did you clear the high ground?" "We don't have the angle," Graves snapped, looking up. "We're suppressed from the north. The bird has to come in fast." Elara pushed herself off the barrier. Pain shot through her arm, white hot and blinding, but she shoved it into a mental box labeled "Ignore." She dragged her rifle barrel up, resting it on the hood of the wrecked MR app. "They're waiting," she muttered. She pressed her eye to the scope. The thermal image was grainy. The sensor was overheating from hours of use. She scanned the roofline to the east. Nothing. She scanned the west. Heat. 3 distinct signatures popped up on the parapet of the western tenement. One was kneeling, the loader. One was standing with a long tube on his shoulder, the gunner. The third was pointing, the spotter. They were waiting for the helicopter to flare for landing. "RPG!" Elara screamed, though her voice was barely a rasp. "West roof, 11 o'clock!" "I don't see them!" Miller yelled, panning his rifle. "No visual!" They were behind the parapet, only exposing themselves to the flight path. The SEALs on the ground couldn't see them. Only Elara could. "Valkyrie, abort! Abort, run!" Graves shouted into the handset. "Negative, Bravo. We are committed. Fuel is bingo. We are coming down." The roar of the Black Hawk was deafening now. The wind picked up, swirling trash and dust into a blinding vortex. Elara checked her chamber. 1 round loaded. 1 in the magazine. 2 rounds. 3 targets. If she shot the gunner, the loader would pick up the tube. If she shot the loader, the gunner would still fire. If she shot the spotter, they would fire blindly and might get lucky. She needed to kill the gunner and the loader, instantly. She watched the heat signatures. The gunner stepped forward to the edge of the roof to take aim at the approaching helicopter. The loader stepped up right behind him, clapping him on the shoulder to signal the rocket was armed. Alignment. For a fraction of a second, the loader's chest was directly behind the gunner's spine. "Geometry," Elara whispered. The world narrowed. The pain vanished. The noise of the rotors faded. There was only the reticle, the wind call, and the 2 glowing ghosts on her screen. Breath out. She squeezed. Crack. The rifle bucked, tearing at the fresh stitches of her wound. The bullet struck the RPG gunner between the shoulder blades. It passed through his spine, exited his chest, and slammed into the center mass of the loader standing directly behind him. Both men dropped instantly, collapsing like marionettes with their strings cut. The RPG tube fell from the gunner's hands, clattering harmlessly onto the roof. 2 down, 1 left. The spotter panicked. He grabbed the fallen RPG. Elara worked the bolt. The casing flew out. The final round slid into the chamber. Don't miss. The spotter hoisted the tube, not bothering to aim, just pointing it wildly at the descending helicopter. Elara didn't wait for the perfect picture. She fired on instinct. Crack. The round took the spotter in the hip, spinning him around. He fell, and the rocket launcher discharged into the sky, the warhead spiraling harmlessly into the night clouds before detonating in a flash of useless orange fire. Clear! Elara gasped, her vision tunneling. Rooftops clear! The Black Hawk roared overhead, its downdraft flattening the grass and whipping Elara's hair across her face. The wheels hit the asphalt with a heavy thud. Load up! Go! Go! Graves was screaming, grabbing Elara by her good arm. She stumbled, her legs finally giving out. Sledge was there instantly, scooping her up as if she weighed nothing. He ran toward the open door of the helicopter. Elara's head lolled back against Sledge's chest armor. She watched the rooftops recede as he threw her onto the floor of the cabin. The SEALs piled in. The crew chief opened up with the minigun, spraying the tree line. The bird lifted, lurching into the air. They were safe. They were leaving. Elara closed her eyes, letting the darkness take her. But just as the door slid shut, through the gap, she saw movement in the rubble pile directly next to where she had been standing moments ago. A single heat signature. Small. Low to the ground. It wasn't a soldier. It was the boy from the cold open. The one she hadn't shot. He wasn't holding a wire this time. He was holding a phone. Elara tried to lift her hand, tried to scream, but her voice was gone and the darkness was too heavy. Time, 0402 Zulu, location, LZ Bravo, compromised. ROE, status black. The boy on the phone didn't call his mother. He dialed a sequence. Under the asphalt, 20 meters from the helicopter's landing gear, a 150mm artillery shell buried in the sewers detonated. It wasn't a direct hit, but the shockwave was a hammer of God. The Black Hawk, hovering 5 feet off the ground, was slapped sideways. The rotor blades flexed, screaming as they bit into the thick, dust-choked air. The pilot fought the stick, but the bird slammed hard onto the deck, bouncing violently. The impact threw the SEALs inside the cabin like dice in a cup. Elara, unsecured near the open door, was ejected. She hit the pavement hard, rolling through the debris until she slammed into the remains of the concrete barrier she had used moments before. Her rifle clattered to the ground next to her. Valkyrie is down! Valkyrie is down! We have rotor warnings! The pilot screamed over the external speakers. Elara gasped, tasting copper and ash. She looked up. The helicopter was upright but listing heavily. The engine was whining, trying to regain RPMs. The SEALs were scrambling inside, dazed, trying to set up a perimeter from the doors. But they were looking the wrong way. From the rubble of a collapsed parking garage to the north, the dead angle Graves had mentioned, a new threat emerged. Not a militia squad, a hunter-killer team. 3 men, 2 RPG-7s, 1 PKM machine gun. They weren't firing yet. They were taking their time. They were lining up the shot on the crippled bird's engine exhaust. At this range, 70 meters, they couldn't miss. Elara reached for her rifle. Her left arm was useless, a screaming agony of torn muscle. She dragged the Mk-13 into the crook of her shoulder with her right hand. She checked the chamber. Empty. She checked the mag. Empty. "No," she whispered. The word was a prayer. She frantically patted her chest rig. Nothing. She checked the side saddle on the stock. 1 round. It was a tip she had marked with red nail polish. A tracer. M62 incendiary. It was meant for signaling, not killing. She thumbed it into the chamber and slammed the bolt home. She looked at the RPG team. They were behind a heavy concrete pillar. She couldn't hit them. She didn't have the angle. Even if she did, 1 bullet wouldn't stop 3 men. If she did nothing, the SEALs died in 10 seconds. If she fired at them and missed, they ignored her and killed the SEALs. She had to make them look at her. She had to make herself a target so juicy, so immediate that they couldn't resist. She looked to her right. 10 meters away, the wreckage of the technical truck she had destroyed earlier was still smoldering. But the saddle tank on the side, the auxiliary fuel reservoir, was intact. Ruptured, leaking, but intact. It was right, next to her. "Graves," she keyed the mic, her voice strangely calm. "Get the bird up. Now." "Ghost, where are you? We can't see you." "Don't look for me. Just fly." Elara didn't aim at the enemy. She aimed at the fuel tank 5 meters to her right. She closed her eyes for a split second, picturing her father's face. Then she opened them. Squeeze. Crack. The tracer round streaked through the darkness like a burning meteor. It punched into the steel tank. The friction and the incendiary compound ignited the fumes instantly. Whump! A massive sphere of orange fire erupted, consuming the wreckage and rolling over Elara's position. The shockwave knocked the breath out of her. The heat was searing, singeing her eyebrows and hair. She lay in the glow, bathed in light, a silhouette of defiance against the flames. To the enemy RPG team, she was suddenly the most visible thing in the city. A sniper illuminated by hellfire right in front of them. Instinct took over. The discipline of the RPG gunners broke. They swung their tubes away from the dark, dust-obscured helicopter and toward the bright, burning threat. Whoosh, whoosh, 2 rockets streaked toward her. Elara curled into a ball behind the concrete barrier. The first rocket hit the barrier's face. The explosion shattered the concrete, burying her in rubble and dust. The second rocket flew high, detonating against the toll booth wall behind her. But they hadn't fired at the bird. "Clear! We are clear!" the pilot shouted. "Torque is rising! We are lifting!" The Blackhawk's engines roared. The bird lurched into the sky, clawing for altitude, swinging away from the fireball. Graves was hanging out the door, scanning the ground. He saw the fire. He saw the crater where the barrier had been. "Ghost! Ghost!" There was no answer, just the crackle of the flames and the static of an empty channel. "She's gone, LT! She's gone!" Sledge yelled, pulling Graves back as the helicopter banked hard to avoid a stream of machine gun fire. Elara lay under the slab of concrete. Her ears were ringing with a silence so profound, it felt like death. She couldn't move her legs. She couldn't feel her rifle. She watched the red anti-collision lights of the Blackhawk fade into the clouds. They were safe, and she was alone. The flames popped and hissed nearby. Boots crunched on the gravel. The enemy was coming to check their kill. Elara's hand drifted to her chest. She found the handle of her knife. It was small. It was futile, but it was all she had left. Time, 0405 Zulu location, LZ Bravo, ruins, ROE, status black. The fire from the exploded fuel tank was dying down, settling into a low, sullen burn that cast long, dancing shadows across the debris field. Elara couldn't feel her legs. The concrete slab that had saved her from the rocket blast was now a tombstone pinning her lower body. She wasn't crushed. There was a pocket of space created by the rebar. But she was trapped. Her left arm was a useless ruin of bloody fabric and shredded muscle. Her right hand gripped the hilt of her combat knife so hard her knuckles were white. She stopped breathing. She forced her heart rate down, fighting the panic that clawed at her throat. Crunch, crunch. Boots on gravel. They were coming. Not running, walking. They were confident. They had seen the helicopter leave. They knew the sniper was alone, wounded, and buried. "Shuf Huna," a voice rasped just feet away. "Look here." Elara pressed her cheek into the dirt, closing her eyes to slits. Through the gap in the concrete, she saw them. 3 pairs of worn combat boots, the hem of a dish dasha. The barrel of an AKM pointed at the ground. They were looking for a body to drag through the streets. She tightened her grip on the knife. It was a ludicrous mismatch. If they found her, she would have 1 strike. Maybe she could take the first one's femoral artery. Maybe she could die biting. The boots stopped. A hand reached down, grabbing the edge of the concrete slab. "This is it," she thought. "Dad, I'm sorry." The man grunted, straining to lift the debris. Light flooded her hiding spot. She tensed her muscles to lunge. Thump, 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 thump. The sound wasn't gunfire. It was the heavy, rhythmic beating of the air, a vibration that shook the ground deeper than the artillery had. The militia fighter froze. He looked up. The sound changed pitch. It went from the low thud of retreat to the high-pitched whine of a dive. Then came the noise that every infantryman fears more than God. Brrrt! It sounded like canvas ripping, amplified 1,000 times, a long, continuous roar of ungodly power. The ground around the militia fighters exploded. The M134 minigun on the side of the returning Blackhawk was spitting 3,000 rounds a minute. It didn't just kill the men. It disintegrated the space they occupied. The concrete, the dirt, the bodies, everything was churned into a cloud of pink mist and gray dust. Elara screamed, covering her head as stone chips rained down on her. The noise was absolute. It vibrated in her teeth, in her bones. Then silence. The rotor wash hit her a second later, a hurricane wind that blew the smoke away. The helicopter was hovering 10 feet off the deck, its wheels skirmishing the top of the barrier. "Cover! Sledge on the gun! Miller with me!" It was Graves. Elara looked up through the dust. A figure jumped from the bird, hitting the ground with a heavy thud. He didn't look for cover. He didn't scan for targets. He ran straight for the fire. He tore the concrete slab off her with a roar of exertion that cut through the engine whine. "Ghost!" He was there. His face was streaked with soot, his eyes wide and frantic. He looked at her, at the blood, the dust, the knife still clutched in her hand. I'm here," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I got you," Graves said, his voice cracked. "I got you. Drop the knife, Elara, drop it." She hadn't realized she was pointing it at him. She let it fall. He didn't wait for a medic. He grabbed her by her harness and pulled her free from the rubble. She screamed as her leg twisted, but he didn't stop. He scooped her up, cradling her against his armor plate like a child. "Go, go, go!" he screamed at the pilot. He ran back to the bird, bullets from the surviving enemy starting to peck at the fuselage. He threw her onto the floor of the cabin and dove in on top of her as the helicopter banked hard, pulling G-forces that pressed them into the deck. The minigun opened up again, answering the enemy fire with another long, hateful burst. Elara lay on the diamond plate floor, staring up at the ceiling of the cabin. Sledge was kneeling over her, ripping open a fresh trauma dressing. Miller was on the other door gun, screaming coordinates, but it was Graves she looked at. The lieutenant was sitting back against the bulkhead, chest heaving, wiping her blood, off his hands. He caught her eye. He didn't smile. He didn't give a thumbs up. He just nodded, a single, sharp nod. "We don't leave our own." Elara closed her eyes. The adrenaline crash hit her like a sledgehammer. The pain in her arm, her leg, her ribs, it all arrived at once. But underneath the pain was something else, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. They had come back, against orders, against logic. They had turned the bird around. She wasn't a ghost anymore. "Status?" Graves asked Sledge. "She's torn up, LT," Sledge replied, packing the wound. "But she's stable. Pulse is weirdly slow." "It's always slow," Elara murmured, drifting into the gray. "That's the trick." "Sleep, kid," Graves said softly. "We have the watch." And for the first time in 18 hours, Elara Vance let go. Time: 05:30 Zulu location. Airspace over Northern Sector, FOB Anvil. ROE, status green, RTB, return to base. The flight back was louder than the battle, yet it felt quieter. Elara sat strapped into the web seat, her legs extended, her head resting against the vibrating aluminum frame of the Blackhawk. Sledge had finished his work. Her left arm was a bulky mass of pressure dressings and ace bandages, immobilized against her chest. Her face was a mask of gray dust, streaked with sweat and the soot from the fuel explosion. She looked small, without the rifle, which lay at her feet, scarred and dirty, and without the tension of the scope, she shrank back into her frame. She looked like what she was, a 19-year-old girl who should be in a college dorm, not bleeding out in a helicopter over a failed state. But the men across from her didn't see a girl anymore. Miller sat directly opposite. He was staring at her boots. He held his own weapon loosely, his hands stained with carbon. Every few seconds, his eyes would flick up to her face, then dart away when he realized she was watching. It wasn't the look of a predator assessing prey. It was the look of a man who had seen a ghost. He was replaying the bridge crossing in his head, the shot that cracked the engine block, the physics of it. Next to him, Sledge wiped his face with a rag. He looked exhausted, his massive shoulders slumped. He caught Elara's eye and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't a smile. It was a receipt. "I am here because of you." And then there was Graves. The lieutenant sat by the open door, one leg dangling out into the slipstream. He wasn't looking at his team. He was watching the desert floor speed by below, the sun beginning to crack the horizon with a bruised purple light. Elara felt the adrenaline leaving her system. It was a physical crash, brutal and nauseating. Her hands began to shake again, not from fear, but from the sudden absence of the chemicals that had kept her moving. Her teeth chattered. The cold wind at altitude cut through her torn uniform. She tried to reach for the water bladder on her back, but her injured arm wouldn't cooperate, and her good hand was trapped under the harness. She gave up, letting her head fall back, closing her eyes against the dryness in her throat. Something nudged her knee. Elara opened her eyes. Graves was leaning forward. He held out his canteen. The plastic was battered, covered in duct tape. The cabin was loud, drowning out any attempt at conversation. Graves didn't speak. He just held the water there, his expression unreadable behind his ballistic glasses. Elara took it with her right hand. She unscrewed the cap, her fingers fumbling slightly. She drank. The water was warm and tasted of iodine, but it was the best thing she had ever consumed. She drank until she choked, coughing water down her chin. She handed it back. "Thanks," she mouthed. Graves took the canteen. He didn't wipe the rim. He took a drink himself, capping it and shoving it back into his pouch. It was a small thing. A shared germs, shared water thing. In the tribal language of the platoon, it was an admission. You are not a guest. You are pack. The pitch of the rotors changed. The bird flared, the nose pitching up as they descended toward the lights of forward operating base Anvil. The wheels touched the tarmac with a gentle bump. The engines spooled down, the whine dropping to a low moan. "Weapons clear," Graves ordered, his voice rasping over the comms. The men stood up, mechanically dropping magazines and clearing chambers. Clack, 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 clack. Elara struggled to stand. Sledge reached out a hand to help her, but she shook her head. She grabbed the frame of the door and pulled herself up. She needed to walk. She needed to prove, mostly to herself, that she was still vertical. She grabbed the drag bag of her rifle with her good hand, though. Ramp lowered. The cool morning air of the base hit them. It smelled of burning trash and diesel, the smell of safety. A medical team was waiting, running toward the bird with a stretcher. "I can walk," Elara said, stepping onto the tarmac. Her voice was stronger now. "I'm walking." The medics slowed down, looking to Graves for confirmation. "Let her walk," Graves said. Elara moved past the team. She didn't stop to debrief. She didn't stop to high-five. She walked with a limp, dragging the heavy rifle case behind her like a shadow. As she passed the group of SEALs, they didn't turn away. They stood in a loose line, watching her go. There were no jeers, no comments about her age, no sneers about her gender. 18, Miller whispered, shaking his head as he watched her retreating figure. "She's 18, LT. What the hell is she going to be when she's 25? Graves watched her disappear into the medical tent. He remembered the shot through the wall, the legs of the mob, the burning fuel tank. He remembered the look in her eyes, the terrifying, empty calm of a creature bred for this exact environment. "She won't be 25? Graves said quietly, turning back to his men. "Not if she keeps doing the math like that." He slung his rifle. "Debrief in 20. Shower, eat, write your reports." "What do we put in the report?" Sledge asked. "About the bridge? About the civilians?" Graves looked at the sunrise. "We write exactly what happened," he said. "We got pinned. We got lucky. And the asset performed within acceptable parameters." It was a lie. They all knew it. Acceptable was a word for standard infantry. What they had seen was an anomaly, a singularity. Inside the medical tent, Elara sat on the edge of a cot. A corpsman was cutting away her shirt to get to the wound. "This is going to sting, Corporal," the corpsman said. Elara didn't answer. She was looking at her hands. They were steady again. The heart rate monitor on her finger beeped a slow, rhythmic cadence. Beep, beep, beep. 42 beats per minute. She was alive. But as the antiseptic touched the raw flesh and she didn't even flinch, she wondered if the girl who had boarded the plane yesterday had died in that tower, leaving only the ghost behind. She looked up at the tent ceiling. "Ready for the next one," she whispered.